are living in a moment where noise often replaces wisdom. Outrage substitutes for understanding, and power is confused with moral authority. In times like these, societies have always turned not to politicians first, but to conscience. To the faith leaders that we invited on today, Pastor A.R. Bernard and Gregory Seltz, who are tasked not with amplifying division, but with naming it right and wrong, even when it is uncomfortable, and with reminding us that justice without mercy becomes cruelty, and mercy without truth becomes surrender. Today we ask Pastor Bernard and Mr. Seltz, not for slogans, but for morality, moral, in a time of political unrest and just continuous social fracture. When truth feels negotiable and anger is rewarded, the role of the clergy becomes more urgent, not to take sides, but to speak to the soul of a nation. Our conversation today is about moral clarity, what faith demands of us when the world is loud, divided, and searching. Pastor Bernard, welcome. How do you respond? The pastor has no audio. We can't hear you, Pastor. So, Gregory, I'm gonna start with you.
Let me just jump in and just say, the moral aspect of who we are as a people is what actually sustains a nation, and that's where this discussion has to start. What does God say about things? The Ten Commandments is a foundational set of truths that this culture has been built upon, and so there is going to be that final discussion, because no politics and policies, that's the last resort of things. I always think of politicians as folks like referees. We're the ones who play the game, and that has to come from self-governance. That has to come from a moral sense of oneself, a virtuous sense of oneself. And that's where the Bible speaks very clearly about discipleship and citizenship. And so we've got to start that discussion there, even for the sake of our culture, not just for the sake of our lives with our Lord.
Pastor, you're good now. Let us come back to you.
5, 6,
Go
7,
ahead.
8, 9, 10.
Go ahead, Pastor.
First of all, Armstrong, thank you for having me on your program. It's a blessing to join you and your guest and to talk about such an important subject matter at a time like this. Let me first say, as a cleric, religion brings a moral value consensus to society, Armstrong, which is necessary for justice and concord. And I have to agree with the guest, because civilization doesn't begin with politics. It begins with moral order. Every stable civilization, Armstrong, is built on moral law, not human preference, not human power or raw power, but on an objective sense of right and wrong that transcends the individual. Even in a nation such as ours, which we believe in rugged individualism, that's important value to us. But historically, moral law has come from a belief that there is a God above us, and therefore no one among us is ultimate. That's why when elected officials, part of the history of our nation, when they're sworn into office, they put their hand on a religious book. And they are saying that we're not only answerable to the people, but we're also held to a higher authority.
So let me follow up with you, Pastor. When everything feels political, what does it mean to speak morally without becoming partisan?
I think we have to understand that, again, without moral values, without a moral system within society, all right, all we have is managed chaos. In every civilization around the world, Armstrong, there are three systems that govern that society. The political system, which is government, which is about the legitimization and distribution of power, the economic system, which is about the creation of wealth, production, and distribution of resources. But there's also the moral system, our families, which are foundational, our educational institutions, and our religious institutions, our houses of worship. And when the moral system is faltering, the rest of the society can stand to collapse. And I don't say that apocalyptically, but I say that as a reality throughout history.
Pastor Seltz, is silence ever a moral position, or is it sometimes a failure of courage? And how do you discern the difference?
Say again, the first thing is something. What was the first part of your question? I didn't hear that.
Is silence ever a moral position, or is it sometimes
silence.
a failure of courage? And how do you sort of discern the difference?
Well, you need to understand, first of all, the level of this discussion is when does the church speak, thus saith the Lord, to the whole culture or to the political system? There are times when the Bible doesn't speak on a particular issue, and that's where our silence is actually warranted, because we have to work these things out one to another. But where the Bible speaks about foundational things, then silence becomes acquiescence, and we're part of the problem. And so I would just say this, we talk about that our founders said that there are inalienable rights, and they're self-evident: life, liberty, and the virtuous pursuit of happiness. But those things are dependent on two things. Number one, self-governance, and that's the moral order that's within each human being in their conscience, reflected in the Ten Commandments. But the duties to God. And if you can't define what those duties to God, all these inalienable rights come crashing down. And that's where foundational things like life, foundational things like protection and property, foundational things, thou shalt not bear false witness, and those kinds of things are foundational discussions. And we have some thus saith the Lord's to the culture there. If you're not willing to speak those things, then God can't be part of your solutions either.
Pastor Bernard, what is the danger when clergy confuse relevance with righteousness?
Well, they can easily fall into the trap of politicizing our faith and exchanging their moral authority, which is one of the authority that God gives us as clergy, for political power. And that's a dangerous thing. But let me just, respond to something that our guest said, and that is the Bible's definition of authority, Armstrong, begins with stewardship. Authority is not self-generated. It's delegated. Leaders are accountable first to God, then to the people. And, cultural definitions of authority are in contrast to that, and they reduce power to whoever has a microphone, whoever has the numbers, likes, followers, influence, or force that they have to impose their will on others. So I think it's important because everything rises and falls on leadership, Armstrong, and godly leadership understands that they are first responsible to God, which is a higher authority, and then to the people.
So
it's a stewardship position.
So, Pastor, what happens then, you as a faith leader, should your challenge of power, let's say even when that power aligns with the congregation's politics?
Armstrong, as clergy, right, we have both a pastoral voice and a prophetic voice. And the prophetic is predictive to the future, but primarily analytical to the present. The prophets would analyze the spiritual, moral, social, political, and even economic conditions of the society. And they would hear from God and then speak into those conditions. And when the society refused to respond to the moral voice of the prophet speaking truth to power, then the prophet becomes predictive and says, look, if you don't change, then this is the outcome. It's true in the Old Testament, it's true now. When societies abandon that higher accountability, Armstrong, chaos is not an accident. It is inevitable. Remove God from the public conscience, and something else rushes in to fill the vacuum. Ideology, tribalism, nationalism, or the state itself will rush in and fill that vacuum. So we have a responsibility as watchmen at the gate to be pastoral, to be filled with grace, but also to proclaim truth, which is our prophetic responsibility. And we have to learn to balance the two, by the way.
But Pastor Seltz, what does your faith tradition say about when pastors and people of the cloth telling uncomfortable truths to those who support you financially or socially, but you don't necessarily agree where they are on same-sex marriage, gender identity, sex before marriage, adultery?
Yeah.
Speak to that.
Well, I mean, the Bible's got two themes, law and gospel. And I don't talk about balance, I talk about differentiation. That's our tradition. And the law of God actually convicts us of our sin, but it also, one of the uses of the law is to curb our outward behavior from the kinds of evil that human beings can do that can destroy a society. So we preach God's word. I didn't write the Ten Commandments, the Lord did, and he said it's on every conscience. So the law is something that preaches, if you will, to every human being, because God is the one who created us, God is the one who orders us, God is the one who holds us accountable. But we do know this, the law doesn't save us because it's our sin that's the problem. We can't even do what we know is right. That's Romans 7. And then Romans 8 talks about this incredible thing that God does all things well for us, lives our life, dies our death, and gives us life. I got to preach that. Now, how it manifests itself and how I deal with culture, how it manifests itself and how I limit government, the Bible's got some wisdom on that too. But the whole point is my job as a pastor is to actually invite people into that relationship. And God actually convicts us and God actually saves us. And I'm called to be faithful to the flock that I'm given.
Pastor, no. I know you want to speak to this. I see it.
There's a big problem with differentiation canceling balance.
I'm going to take a break. Okay. I can see it. I can feel it.
Okay.
We'll come back to you. We'll be back. It's all yours, Pastor Bernard.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just say I have to push back when we talk about differentiation versus balance. The problem in our society now is an imbalance. We understand the need for law and order. We also understand the need for grace. The scripture is clear that grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. And Jesus now, when he came, challenged the law, because the law was being implemented without an understanding of context and other issues that come into play. Every encounter that he had brought a balance of grace and truth. We live in a tension between the two. We need both, but it's about how we balance those things. And for me, in terms of my faith tradition, I just don't extract Old Testament's text without seeing it through the lens of the New Testament revelation of Jesus Christ. He was clear that the Old Testament law, prophets, and Psalms gave us a new lens with which to see and understand that Old Testament. So he brings a balance of grace and truth, and we live in a tension between the two.
You know, Pastor Seltz.
I need to jump in and clarify something. I'm not talking about civil law. I'm not talking about positive law. I'm talking about the law of God and how it functions in like Romans 7. So I'm talking about God's law and how it functions. And so when we preach the law of God and we actually look for the law to save us, we're actually misusing God's law, because God's law, while it's true, like Paul says, it exposes us to our need for God. So I'm not talking about the extension and how it becomes civil law and how it becomes practiced in our culture. Obviously, we have to then discuss, well, what's the role of the state? What's the role of policy? All those things. I'm just talking about the themes of the Bible as law and gospel. In the Old Testament, it's law and promise yet to be fulfilled. In the New Testament, it's law and promise fulfilled. I agree with you. We have to, when I say differentiate, I'm saying make sure that you are looking for what those themes, what those words of God can do in your life. That's what I mean by differentiation.
Oh, okay. I appreciate that, because I thought we were applying this to what's happening in our society. And the reality is that we live in a tension between law and grace. Law as a structured system to guide us, but grace as an understanding of how that system can be sinful because it is run by people who are broken and wounded. So we have to understand both the individual's context and the context created by those individuals who are broken and wounded, and yet making decisions on how those systems and structures apply to the individual within the society.
Let me move this conversation into uncomfortable waters. I was in Florida recently, and I ran, and this wise old lady, she had to be in her 80s, and we were having surface conversation, and all of a sudden she got an impression of my respect for President Trump, and then she finally said, I feel the same way, but I can't talk this way among my friends. I have to be careful who I talk to. She says, he does the right thing on his biological males, on same-sex marriages, on gender affirming. I mean, so many things that I believe in morality, but sometimes he seems so cruel, the things he says about Rob Ryan, the things that he said about Charlie Kirk's funeral. I'm unforgiving, I want to punish my enemies. She said, but it's such a contradiction for me. And then she asked me, how do you see him in the context of morality, and how should I feel about him? Because there are a lot of things that he does good, but there are a lot of things about him that frightens me as a person of faith. I'll start with you, Pastor.
Well, I'll defer to your guest to answer that. I want to understand his context and perspective on it.
Okay.
Yeah, I can. It's very easy for me in that sense of saying, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. And the early church had to honor Caesar. If you think Donald Trump is bad, Caesar was even worse. And so there comes a point where I'm saying, is he doing the Caesar things that I think needs to be done, and especially in the context of a constitutional limited government? So all of these kinds of things, these discussions of what policy is and those things, it's Jesus who differentiates. And Pastor Bernard, what I was saying too about the differentiation of law and gospel, it then causes me to have a limit.
I want to stick with the Trump question, because I want the pastor to respond. So finish what you're saying about the context. Give to Caesar what is Caesar.
When I look at Trump, I'm judging him by what I demand. Is he the kind of person that reflects my values perfectly? No, absolutely not. Is he the kind of person that I would want to be? I would talk to him about discipleship. I would talk to him about his tone. I would talk to him about those things. But the things he's doing that give power back to the people, and in a constitutional republic, I go, he's doing the kinds of things that we demand. Actually, he's not Caesar. The citizen is Caesar in America, and this is what we demand of our presidents. He's supposed to be a good umpire, and I don't look for him to be anything more than that.
Pastor.
Look, I think this administration, because of Donald Trump, has put us in a deeper tension than we've been all along. We vote and we put a person in power. The question is, by what standards are we judging that individual's deserving of our vote? And we can't, especially as the church, we can't, as people who supposedly represent the moral order, easily excuse what we see and demand in a leader, in righteousness, in integrity, in moral standard. All right, and not see that that's not matching up. So this administration and this particular president has deepened a divide and brought about this great tension between what we believe leaders should exemplify, that we can say to our children, that's the kind of person that I want you to grow up to be like. This is the kind of leadership that the Bible talks about. And separate that now from the character and morality that has been demonstrated by Donald Trump, even though he's made decisions that I agree with, that I support. We are left in a cognitive dissonance in this country whenever we use our power and influence and prophetic voice and moral voice to put someone in a position of power that is inconsistent with that moral standard or those values, and then we have to explain why. And I think where we failed as a church, instead of being honest and saying, look, this individual represents my social and political values, and I make a distinction between the moral standard that is typical of my faith and what I believe the nation needs right now in policy and practice. But we didn't do that.
So, that leads me to this, Pastor Seltz. Can a society survive without moral order, and who is responsible for defining that order?
Well,
you're asking me?
Oh, Pastor Seltz.
Oh.
Well, I don't have any problem with Pastor Bernard's assessment of the way Donald Trump goes about his business. The question is, what business do I want him to go about? And I could do the same thing with like a Bill Clinton. I could do the same thing with all those things. My goal was to say, what kind of referee do I have in this game, and is he a good referee? If I find out he's a kind of a jerk on top of that, that's another discussion to be had. But when it comes down to the moral order and what kind of a culture we're going to be, the American society said the citizen is Caesar, the citizen of his home. These other people work for us, and that is, so it begins with us in our communities, in our churches, in our neighborhoods, and if we won't take that moral responsibility back to actually look for politicians to lead the way on this, they're the ones who follow. They follow us.
Pastor,
but is that true? Is that really true? When a politician can lose the popular vote, but still win by the Electoral College? Who's really making the decision as to who gains that power in leadership? Is it the people? Or is it the system?
I'm going to stay away. We're not going to go down that path because I have another question for the pastor, okay? When protests turn destructive, Pastor, what moral line has been crossed, and who should say so? And has our culture elevated victimhood in ways that weaken personal responsibility?
Again, you're talking back. I'm sorry, my guest. I defer.
Bernard?
No, I defer to our guest, please.
Well, I mean, the troubling thing for me is that when I speak around the country, colleges and things, the first question they want to know is, when can we be civilly disobedient? And that's Christians asking. And I keep thinking, no, you got to be careful about that, because the first thing that we should be is obedient to God. And even if there's civil disobedience, it's always obedience to something higher than us. Our culture's become civilly disobedient for political and ideological purposes, which I can't see ever is going to be a great thing. There's always got to be a higher moral authority, a higher thing that calls us to obedience. And if that requires us then suffering for that, then that's where we would go with that discussion. I don't think people are talking about civil disobedience that way.
Pastor Bernard?
Yeah, unfortunately, look, our nation was founded on civil disobedience. We made decisions that there is a higher authority than, the ruling class that was over us, or a king in England. So pushing back against the establishment is part of the American psyche. I get that. I understand that. But I think that we need to do that within the confines of the law. And that's a tension. You have a law enforcement officer who is trying to allow a person to exercise their right to disagree, and yet that law enforcement officer has to maintain law and order. It is not easy. We have to have the right training of these law enforcement officers to understand the power that they have in terms of discretion, when to use force, what level of force they need to use in order to respond. It is nuanced, it is complex, and it can't be reduced to slogans or headlines by media.
How does your faith, Pastor Seltz, affirm human dignity without excusing harmful behavior?
Well, but that's what I said. As a that's a pastoral question for me with my people, and I speak the truth in love, and then we actually try to work where we learn how to. Every one of us is 100% sinner from God's point of view. So let me just say that's the biblical testimony, and so every one of us needs this 100% grace that comes by Christ alone. And so even as I approach someone who has this particular sin or that particular sin, it's just a manifestation of a deeper issue, and so I can preach the full power of the law of God as a broken sinner myself, and then point to the Christ who actually can cover and forgive and to empower us to live a different life. That's how I approach every human being. And I think as a pastor, but I don't look to the state to do any of that stuff. That's our job. That's where the free people literally create the republic and sustain the republic by being the kind of neighbors that God would call us to be.
Do we have a responsibility to influence the state in terms
Absolutely.
of policy?
Absolutely.
And how do we engage in that influence without relationship, without engagement?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, differentiation doesn't mean, in fact, when we hear separation of church and state, I would say, no, differentiation is a better word, because we engage God's preserving work, which is the state's role, and we can speak some thus saith the Lord to the state. Romans 13 would say, thus saith the Lord, this is your job. But we also don't expect the state to solve the heart problems and the community problems that only changed hearts can do. That's the church's problem. That's where Jesus says, put your sword away.
I don't.
Have we made that? I don't mean to take over your interview.
Listen.
I'm intrigued by my brother's perspective.
Listen, I got to continue. I don't want this conversation to stop. So I'm going to have you guys stay, okay? And I'm going to make some adjustments here. But you guys don't go anywhere, okay? We've got to continue this conversation. We'll be back. Don't go away. Where's Hilary?
Right here.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence, there's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. I'm so happy Hilary Fordwich is joining our conversation today. She and I had other things to talk about, but this moral conversation is so important. She said, I would love to talk about morality and faith. I said, well, so we will. So let me start with you, Hilary. Of course, that's Pastor Bernard and Pastor Gary Seltz. But are Western nations facing a spiritual crisis? And how does Europe illustrate life after faith?
Well, there is an existential threat. I mean, obviously, Muslims invaded many centuries ago, and the same thing has happened now in terms of demographics. Actually, the #1 baby name in the whole of the UK last year was Mohammed, and the second baby name, most popular baby name, was Mohammed. Now, do I think there's anything wrong with being Muslim? No, not necessarily. But when you go to another nation and you retain your own religion, your own values, your own spiritual values, and you're not becoming assimilated into that country, then basically what you're doing is you're basically invading in terms of faith and culture. And so what we're seeing, and President Trump is totally right on this, we're seeing basically the collapse of traditional European values, and by country. Of course, there were different cultural nuances per nation, and I'll always refer to what Henry Kissinger said when the EU was forming. He said, "I'll believe in one Europe when there's one phone number to call." European countries had their distinct cultures, their distinct histories, and in many instances distinct faiths, and that's all becoming amalgamated now under the umbrella of sort of this Muslim invasion, if you will, because they don't want to assimilate.
Pastor Seltz, is that also what's happening here in the United States?
Well, I'm from Dearborn, so this is a very personal thing. And I've got many friends who are from Iran. I've got many friends who come from Muslim countries. And it's the same kind of discussion. What is the overriding worldview that undergirds what we're talking about here? This is where Christians have lost their ability to defend what I call the proper differentiation or distinction between church and state. We're dealing with Iran, we're dealing with an Islamic perspective that oftentimes merges the state and the church. So you get this benevolent government from that standpoint. The secular progressives merge it the other way. And here we come and we differentiate. And we say constitutional limited government and free citizens, and that's where the church does its best work freely. So that's the discussion that we got to have about all of this stuff, is what's our framework, what's our moral framework that guides us? Because as Pastor Bernard talked about, this is a country that's built on a creed. We're one of the first countries in the world that really, and then we limited the government's coercive power and expanded the citizen as long as they're self-governing. This is a radical experiment. I pray it works.
You know, this is fascinating because Pastor A.R. Bernard was once a Muslim, embraced the faith, but then he became a Christian minister. Pastor, your perspective and what you're hearing.
Gosh, Armstrong, I think you need a few hours for the show to talk about my journey. You know, I looked at a lot of different religious systems, looking for answers, looking for truth. And I have to make a distinction in terms of how I came to the Christian faith. It was not through a set of moral values. It wasn't through an institution. It was through a person. The person of Jesus Christ. And to this day, Armstrong, it is the person of Jesus Christ, his teachings and his works that continue to intrigue and fascinate me and secure me to this thing called Christianity. We're trying to live it out. We're trying to understand Christendom as a whole. But that's where I landed, because Christianity, the person of Jesus, gave the best answers to the big questions. Why are we here? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live in this world? He gave meaning and purpose to my life like no other mediated religious system with God could provide. And that's why I will continue and never trade this position because of the encounter that I had with the person of Jesus Christ. But kind of getting back to the conversation, Armstrong, Europe is a sobering case study because once it was shaped by Christian moral imagination, all right, which is what we're shaped by in this country, all right, regardless of whether the Constitution clearly states we're a Christian nation or not, which it doesn't. It talks about a nation under God, all right, but we are culturally Christian. Everything about our society has been shaped and fashioned and informed by a Christian identity. Once Europe lost this, having a moral imagination one time, but now post-Christian in practice, the result is not greater unity or freedom, but fragmentation, declining birth rates, cultural exhaustion, and a deep uncertainty about identity itself. And that's why America is in an identity crisis. We're struggling to understand, how do we maintain our shared moral Christian foundation, and at the same time respond to an ever-changing religious landscape, ethnic landscape, cultural landscape, and we haven't done a great job. I love what the pastor said. It's the American experiment, and the experiment is being tested today in ways that we never imagined, and it has been tested throughout our history, and we're going to pass that test because at our core, there is still a shared moral value. It's been layered by a lot of stuff, and we got to peel back those layers to expose that core that has been the American identity.
You know, I find it fascinating. Hilary is in the studio shaping her head. Can Hilary diversity survive without those shared values?
Well, diversity is one thing. I think something that we have to remember is when you look at the moral values, what is the judgment? There's a judgment here. What is good, what is not? In the Quran, unlike Christianity, there are actually verses in the Quran which say, stone and kill the infidel. The Quran teaches hatred and defiance of and lack of tolerance of any other beliefs. This is the thing with diversity. Diversity has the sort of the underlying assumption that you will tolerate somebody who isn't of your religious beliefs, your racial background, your ethnocentric background, or your maybe socioeconomic background. That's what diversity is about. It has the assumption that other people will accept other people. The Quran states not to accept anybody of any other belief. And that's the difference with Christianity. Although you have to remember with Christianity, we need to remember this, being in the United States of America, why is Maryland called Maryland? It is named after Queen Mary. That would be Bloody Queen Mary, who burnt at the stake 7,147 Protestants, burnt them alive at the stake in England. Don't forget there have been wars between Protestants and Catholics. That's over the same gentleman, Jesus, the same book, the same gentleman, the same religions, Christianity. So I grew up in England where in the time of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Catholics were killing Protestants, Protestants were killing Catholics. So I would even say Christianity hasn't always been so tolerant. So the issue is, the issue is not diversity, the issue is tolerance. Do you tolerate people with a diverse background, race, religion than yours? If you tolerate them, diversity works. If you don't tolerate them, it doesn't. Now with my second point with regard to Muslims, don't forget Muslims, and we talked about this, there's an imam who said, we will conquer the West 3 ways. 1, through the womb. Muslims breed 8 to 1, so they're having babies at a rate which no Western nation is. There are many Western nations that are actually on the collapse due to their birth rate, being Italy, I believe Spain, but definitely the UK, Western nations not having enough babies. So number 1, he said, through the womb. Number 2, your liberal values. They've taken advantage of the acceptance, and again, people wanting diversity and being accepting of Muslims. And third, and that would be invasion. And those are the 3, migration. So that's the 3 ways they're able to invade the West. And I would say, I have no problem if somebody else is Muslim if they don't want to kill me because I'm not a Muslim. And so it's the issue is tolerance.
Pastor, quickly.
You know, let me.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Pastor.
Yeah, because I probably have to go by 12:15, Armstrong. I apologize. I would just say this. First of all, Pastor Bernard, when you were talking about that, our faith is Christ alone, grace alone, faith alone, in Christ alone, through the Scripture alone. So I'm with you on all of that. It's a personal relationship with the Lord who actually is the Lord who saves. But then we actually listen to His Word and how He differentiates His saving work from God's preserving work through something like Caesar or government and the like. And if you can't make that differentiation, then you create this thing called the benevolent state. And I think that's the thing that we've got to start battling, because it's really faith-motivated citizens who do the moral things that need to be done, not the coercive power of government that forces us to do that. And learning how to make those distinctions is what allows me to say the state needs to coercively do this here, but that's all they're supposed to do. The rest of it's on us. And I think the American experiment put that faith-motivated aspect, they believed that changed hearts were the only way that this republic was going to survive, and that people would be self-governing, not just because of moral principles, but because they knew a savior, and that savior motivated them to do the right thing, even if it cost. And so I just think that's where the discussion has to go, because otherwise we get into the politics, the discipleship, and all these things get blurred. I think we have to be very clear about the things we're talking about, and I think there's an underlying way to do that. There's foundational principles that help us.
Well, I'm so sad that you have to leave us, Pastor Seltz. This is
Yeah, I had to leave at noon.
and look, and Hilary has added so much richness to a
Yes.
discussion she was not even prepared for. So the Lord is telling us we must continue. So we're going to add Tyler O'Neill from Signal when we return. Bye-bye, Pastor Seltz. We're going to miss
God bless you
though,
guys.
but we're going to come back with more of this. Don't go away.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
Let me welcome Tyler O'Neill, and let me just warn him that the discussion has changed dramatically, so you'll just have to catch on, buddy. But welcome to the broadcast. You raised a very interesting question, Hilary, during the break. You said, what religion?
Yeah. Well, even when you talk about Christianity, and I mentioned this a bit before about Maryland is named after Queen Mary. That would be Bloody Queen Mary, who burnt Protestants at the stake live in London. But why is Virginia named Virginia? A lot of Americans don't even realize it was for the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I, who was a Protestant. So Virginia was always historically a very Protestant state. Maryland was always historically a very Catholic state. So when people talk about Christianity and Jesus, are you talking about Catholics? Are you talking about Protestants? Are you talking about Methodists? What about all the different, and Lutheran? What about all the different denominations of Christianity? It's all fine if you tolerate the other religions. You can't say, well, my religion is the only one and mine is the real truth, because then what about other people's truth? You have to take faith lightly. You have to just take it broadly and lightly. And also always remember how many centuries it was till a word was put down in the Bible. And the issue to always remember is two factors. It was more than 4 centuries. So when there were 4 to 5 generations per century, that was over 20 to 25 generations. So can you name me anything that your great-grandparents said verbatim? No one can ever name anything verbatim their great-grandparents said. So 20 to 25 generations later was when the first words were put in the Bible. That's number one. Number two, it's gone through at least 21 translations to different languages. So when people say the exact words of the Bible, you must take it broadly and lightly. And I think take what Jesus said broadly and lightly for all the good, all the wisdom. And one thing to always remember is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson actually created, and it's not talked about a lot nowadays, the Jeffersonian Bible. He took out all kind of the hocus pocus miracle stuff. And what he had in there was actual truisms in terms of guidance and wisdom, brilliant wisdom for how to live your life. And when you can take it broadly like that, not kill other people, not burn other people at the stake, not hate other people of a different denomination, not be like Northern Ireland where Catholics kill Protestants and Protestants kill Catholics. No, absorb and accept other people's, in quotes, faith, and accept that it's a broad way to live your life with a degree of wisdom. And unlike, and that was my issue about the Quran, where it says kill the infidel, I think religions that are violent and tell you to be intolerant of other religions, that's not the kind of diversity that is, I think, in my humble opinion, healthy for society. We're not going to kill people of other faiths.
Tyler, you want to add something to this?
What do I not want to add? First off, the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament, particularly of the Gospels, are far earlier than the 400s. So this suggestion that we have 20 generations or whatever, that is poppycock. What we have in this situation is, yes, we have the oldest manuscripts going back to, I think it's the 200s. I'd have to get the exact dates right, but that doesn't mean that was when these were written. These were all written. We know that these Gospels were written before the collapse of the temple in Jerusalem. Why do we know that? Because over and over and over again, Jesus says, this temple in Jerusalem is going to be knocked down. There will not be one stone above another. And never, not once in any of those Gospels is it said, oh, and this came about to pass. In other words, there was every incentive for every gospel writer to say, oh yeah, and Jesus was proven true here, now. We see this all throughout the Bible, the biblical books, where they'll say, oh, and that is the name of the place to this day. Every biblical book is written in a historical context, and we know that every single one of those Gospels was written before 70 AD. And, you know, you can say, if you want, that we can't trust them. But we have so many manuscripts that all show the same statements and that show that Jesus presented himself in the same way, regardless of which author of the Gospels is writing. And throughout the letters of Paul, we have repeated over and over again. So we get this claim from Muslims that Jesus never presented himself as actually the Son of God. That is proven false time and time again. And by the way, you know, I have tremendous respect for Thomas Jefferson. I am a big fan of the Declaration of Independence. But you have to look and see, you cannot cut the Bible up in the way that Jefferson did, because if Jesus has no moral authority as the Son of God, as he claimed over and over and over again, and as was made clear in all of the letters of Paul as well, that this is what Jesus meant, if he has no authority there, he's not a great moral teacher. His claims are that he was the Son of God. He's a liar. In fact, he'd have to be a lunatic, and you should not be trusting his word on any moral thing if he is lying on that fundamental claim. So, sorry, Armstrong, I know this is not specifically supposed to be a debate
the fourth century
about
let me
these
get past.
issues.
Let me get past this. Let me tell you.
But the Nicene Creed was a vote in the 4th century to vote for him to be divine. It was a vote in the 4th century.
No, it was clarifying what it was meant when he claimed to be divine. And yes, that was worked out over a long period.
And this is why we have to make a distinction between the institution of Christianity, Christendom, as it has influenced and shaped the world over the last 2,000 years, and the person of Jesus. The 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are in the canon because they stood the test of time. They continue to be the most respected and honored and practiced revelation before official canonization in 397. And those Gospels share with us the person of Jesus, his teachings, and his encounters with people, the life that he lived. And if we don't look at everything that we're talking about politically, socially, and morally through the person of Jesus and how he interacted with institutions of power, whether it be religious, economic, or political, then we lose a lens. I don't use the lens of Christianity or Christendom, because if I did, then I'd have a problem with Christianity's imperialism and the enslavement of African Americans, of Africans into America. I'd have a problem with the Crusades, and I can go on and on and on when it comes to accusing a religious system, all right, or religion of anger and assault against another people. It's the person of Jesus, and that's what we have to wrestle with. And America had and still has, hopefully, if we can recover it, all right, a shared moral culture around the person of Jesus Christ. We've wrestled with interpreting the things that he said, interpreting those encounters that he had, but if we don't get back to that centrality, we are going to be in trouble as a society. When a shared moral culture disappears, identity politics fills the void. People stop seeing one another as neighbors and begin seeing one another as rival groups competing for power, whether it's in a religious context of Islam and Muslims or in Christianity. We fight for recognition and we start fighting for resources. A society without a moral center eventually becomes a battlefield of grievances. And we have to pay attention to how we are identifying ourselves, even when we call ourselves a Christian nation.
Well,
we have to deal with the cognitive dissonance that has played out in our expression of our Christianity.
What's your question?
My question with those that are more knowledgeable than me then is, in the Middle East, find anyone who's named Matthew, Paul, Luke, or John. So where did those names come from? It was to westernize it for the pagans to accept Christianity. So that's where you have to say, obviously, if it was exactly how it had been before the Nicene Creed, if it was exactly accurate, well, there's no one in the Middle East called Matthew, Paul, Luke, Mark, or John.
Tyler, go ahead, Pastor.
Go ahead. Now, I'll let my colleague jump in, and then I will.
Yeah, I mean, so first off, what is the Middle East right now? It's under Arab conquest and Arab dominion, which means that, yes, you don't see the old Latinate names and the Greek names that were there for centuries because the history of the Middle East is complicated. So, with all due respect, I really appreciated your history lesson about Maryland and Virginia. I think what Armstrong is talking about here is where we should go as a society. Are we Christian? Are we not a Christian nation? Where does that fall? You know, we
and
have
which Christianity? Which Christianity
right, exactly.
do we pick?
Well,
I mean,
and
JFK,
I think that
JFK wasn't going to be elected because people said you could not have a Catholic president,
Yes.
and he said, I will not. He had to go into West Virginia and say, I will, a Protestant state, and say, I will not answer to the Pope. And then we accepted Catholicism. Until JFK, Catholics were pilloried in America.
Yes. And
I
for a long
understand that.
period
And that's
of time.
why we have to get back to the person of Jesus, not the different expressions of Christianity
Right.
that show up in denomination and religious system. We have to get back to the person. You talk about the Jeffersonian Bible in the early 1800s, where Jefferson, he tried to create a Jesus that was strictly moral, but without the miracles, without the power of God, without all of those things that made him divine. And it's not going to work because then we are trying to establish a moral order on our own, and we are broken and wounded individuals. And we create broken and wounded systems that actually manifest that brokenness in different ways along the way. We have to be answerable to someone higher than ourselves. And we must believe that there's transcendent authority. And that's what Jesus represents, a transcendent authority.
Tyler?
When that moral order has to rest on basic understandings that our society is built around. So I think we have in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we have rooted in God. And remember, those documents, especially the Declaration of Independence, presents God as an active force in the world. It is not a deistic document. This is not some clockmaker God who stands back. This is a God who is involved. And by the way, we hear the term Judeo-Christian thrown around a lot. I'd love to have us center on Jesus because I think he is the Messiah. But there are a lot of Jews who I consider to be my fellow Americans who I think that their moral compass is strong and informed by the same book and teaching as mine. And frankly, there are some Muslims who I can never know entirely if they're not following taqiyya, which is this doctrine that says that Muslims should lie when they're not in the majority religion. That's a big issue. But I do know that there are a lot of Muslims who advocate for religious freedom and against Islamism, against political Islam.
Yes.
And I also know atheists who work alongside me on conservative things. And I think it's important we have to have a moral bedrock that is able to include people of different faiths.
Well, let me tell you what I know.
I don't know.
And I will tell you.
Although we're out of time, I am so thankful for this conversation today because this was not planned.
Can I?
No, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
A last funny
Enjoy the
note.
NFL weekend.
Church of England.